Thank you again for coming to the Unsung Great, Uncovering Nikkei Histories, based around the wonderful book, The Unsung Great, Stories of Extraordinary Japanese Americans by scholar and journalist Greg Robinson. We have a really wonderful panel, a really wonderful discussion today. And as I mentioned before, please keep engaging with our panelists and let us know if you have any questions. You can use the chat feature and the Q&A feature to ask those questions. So to take this program and start moving forward with it, I'm going to pass it along to Tomo Hirai, who, make sure I'm getting this right, is a queer, trans, Shin Nisei journalist and artist working out of the San Francisco Bay Area. She is a staff writer for the Nichibei Weekly and an editor for Anime Feminist. She's also a freelance translator and diversity consultant in her spare time. So Tomo, I'll welcome you on and then you can take it away from here.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for coming out today, and thank you, Joy. As Joy mentioned, I'm Tomo Hirai, a staff writer for the Nichibei Weekly, and I have the esteemed pleasure of introducing you to the Unsung Great, Uncovering Nikkei Histories with Greg Robinson. I'll start with Greg Robinson, a award-winning professor of history at the La Université du Québec, Montreal French language institution in Montreal, Canada. Greg has been a writer for the Nichibei Weekly and its predecessor, the Nichibei Times, as a columnist for more than a decade, as well as Discover Nikkei. Over the years, as I've edited and read through almost every issue of the Nichibei Weekly, especially since formally joining the staff in 2010, I've had the pleasure of further getting to know Greg over the years through his fascinating columns and in person whenever he comes out to San Francisco. Greg is the author of several notable books on the Japanese American experience, starting with By Order of the President, FDR, and the Internment of Japanese Americans in 2001, to Tragedy of Democracy, Japanese Confinement in North America, After Camp, Portraits in Mid-Century Japanese American Life and Politics, and the subject of today's program, The Unsung Great, Japanese American Sketches. If you didn't know already, this book is on sale at the JANM store at janmstore.com, so you can check it out if you haven't purchased a copy yet. I've looked up to Greg over the years as a scholar because he has brought to life the lives of little-known figures in Japanese American history in a format that's both accessible and engaging to a lay audience. Who knew that there was a connection between Japan and America in the form of the Café du Monde in New Orleans, or the once famous singers and dancers like ballet dancer Sono Sato and her life in pre-war America? And how about the anti-fascist Jack Shirai, who took up arms to fight on the Republican side of the Spanish Civil War, which, by the way, the piece was recently published in the Nichibei Weekly and was co-written with one of today's other panelists, Jonathan Van Harmelen. And what about the series of articles on queer non-Nikkei figures in Japanese American history? Fact of the matter is, I look up to Greg as not only a writer, but as an out gay man highlighting queer Nikkei history each Pride Month. I especially felt fascinated to learn more about queer Japanese Americans because for many years I felt kind of alone as a queer trans woman in Japanese America. So it is a big honor to be able to present to you Professor Greg Robinson today. Greg?
Hello. Thank you everybody for coming. It's a great honor for me to be here today. Thanks to JANM and everybody who came. And I'm happy to have a chance to talk about my new book, The Unsung Great. It's an anthology of the short pieces I wrote on Japanese American history in recent years. It includes an assortment of my great unknown columns from the San Francisco Nichibei Weekly, as Tomo mentioned, as well as some columns that I wrote for Discover Nikkei, the Japanese American National Museum's blog, plus still others that appeared elsewhere or were previously unpublished. More than that, today I want to talk with my friends on the panel about how the book fits into a larger conversation about Japanese American history and how we, as people who have lived and or studied that history, can use it to open new avenues and challenge received ideas about the group, especially in regard to sexuality within Japanese American communities. So I should begin by explaining how this book came about. It's almost 15 years since Kenji Taguma, the dynamic English language editor of what was then the Nichibei Times in San Francisco, first proposed that I write a regular historical column for his newspaper. Kenji expressed to me that he felt the need for new issues and audiences and thought that I might be able to provide something different. In addition to being a trained academic historian specializing in Japanese American history, I had experience as a blogger and a public speaker. And what's more, I was an outsider to the community, not only on ethnic grounds, of course, but also as a New Yorker living in Montreal. I joked that I could therefore more easily write about controversial or taboo subjects because none of my readers would call up my mother to complain. In fact, there was an extra dimension to that joke because my late mother, Toni Robinson, had actually been my scholarly collaborator, a story that I tell in the epilogue of The Unsung Great. But I was touched and inspired by Kenji, especially as a non-American, and by his invitation to become a visible presence in the community. So my new column, dubbed The Great Unknown and the Unknown Great, premiered in the middle of 2007. And when the Nichibei Times folded in 2009, Kenji bravely started his own spin-off newspaper, the Nichibei Weekly, and I moved my column there. During those same years, I contributed once in a while to Discover Nikkei. I found that it was a good outlet for some more in-depth pieces that did not fit comfortably into my Nichibei columns. For example, I wrote about Bill Hosokawa and Buddy Uno, who both wrote for a pro-Japanese collaborationist newspaper in Shanghai. So in 2017, then I agreed to become a regular writer for Discover Nikkei. I continue to contribute on a more or less monthly basis. The difference between the Nichibei and the Discover Nikkei is that my Discover Nikkei articles tend to be longer than my Great Unknown pieces. In fact, many of them are so long that we divide them into two parts. They also draw more from my partnerships with collaborators, notably Jonathan van Harmelen, who is here today and who has his own stream of solo articles as well as our collaborations. Another nice thing about Discover Nikkei is that the staff helps find me cool illustrations to accompany my articles. So from the beginning, my columns were designed as what I called portraits, that is biographical sketches that told a story. You know, my late friend Setsuko Nishi referred to my pieces as bonbons. That is because they were fun and easy to digest. Working on them gives me a platform to share ideas in progress and to include the sometimes kooky facts that I come across in my research, but which don't fit into my more formal works. I've sometimes called it licking the spoon of scholarship, like when you make a cake. But in addition to being fun to read, at least I hope, these works taken together provide a new narrative of Japanese American history, one that goes against the grain of the dominant narrative, as expressed in ethnic histories such as Bill Hosokawa's Nisei, the Quiet Americans. These normal conventional histories start by speaking of the communities of farmers, fishermen, and shopkeepers on the West Coast in the pre-war era, then go on to speak about the tragedy of the camp experience, and then tell more briefly the post-war story of Nisei professionals bouncing back and achieving professional success and social respect. My book goes against this. First, it goes against West Coast centrism by focusing on Nikkei throughout the country. People in communities in places such as New York, Chicago, Idaho, Louisiana, Alabama, and even the Panama Canal Zone. I don't have as much material on Hawaii as I would like, for reasons having mostly to do with accessibility of source material, but at least I mention at different places the large and historically significant presence of Japanese Americans in the islands. The book also goes against the dominant narrative of Japanese Americans in its extended investigation of the resettlement period in the post-war era, which I sometimes call the black hole of Nikkei life because it gets passed over in conventional histories. Most vitally, the reason that it's unique is that I trace the unusual and often rebellious sorts of characters who deviated from community norms, the kind of people whom the artist and writer Mine Okubo, referring to herself, called the misfits of Japanese American life. Creative artists, writers, political activists, and as we'll see shortly today, LGBT Japanese Americans. Furthermore, by highlighting a series of original themes, the chapters in my book suggest new directions for further research. For instance, a central element of the writing that I do is the experience of mixed race Nikkei. From the time of founding of ethnic Japanese communities, even when interracial marriages was illegal on the West Coast and in a good part of the West of the country, they have represented some of the first Japanese Americans in different communities, and they were the most gifted artists, writers, and professionals within the group. It's useful and important to think about their identity formation and the role that their Japanese heritage played in their lives. Another main theme that I treat at length in my work is solidarity between Nikkei and non-Japanese, particularly in the face of mass wartime confinement. African Americans in particular were disproportionately active in favor of equal treatment for Japanese Americans, and I write a lot about connections between Blacks and Japanese Americans. I also explore the vital wartime support offered to Japanese Americans by Chinese Americans. But arguably the most distinctive feature of the Unsung Great, and the main reason for bringing together our remarkable panel this afternoon, is the queer history section, composed mostly of my annual Pride Month columns from Nichibei Weekly. These shed light on the hidden history of LGBT Nikkei and explore the evolution of dominant attitudes towards sexuality, including homosexuality, within the larger Japanese community in America. My hope is that my work will help foster more research on the history of Japanese American sexuality and sexuality in the community generally, which will help us to get past stereotyped views. So I wanted to talk more about that now. To begin with, it's essential to understand Issei sexuality as varied. I think about Amy Tsuruyoshi's book, Queer Compulsions, on the poet Yone Noguchi and his multiple affairs, in which I've even spoken about freewheeling sexuality. But certainly the immigrant generation cannot be understood along a gay-straight continuum, with the dominant model of heterosexual love and then gay people in the shadows. Issei couples, when they came together, often united for family reasons rather than romance. The case of women was also a concrete case, for once, of what Adrienne Rich called compulsory heterosexuality, since the only way that Issei women after 1907 were able to come to North America legally was as wives, most often as picture brides, of male immigrants. That is, their presence in North America was intimately and inextricably associated with their sexuality and their marital status. Tied to husbands and later also to children, and facing the double burden of housework and farm or shop work, they had limited space for developing close relations with other women. Conversely, Issei male laborers, almost without exception, first immigrated to Hawaii or the mainland as single men. Most of these men were unable or unwilling to find Japanese wives. It was no easy task, either locally or in Japan. While some of them, especially outside the West Coast, did find non-Japanese partners, throughout the pre-war period, the numerical majority of the Issei were what we call old bachelors. They shared their living spaces, their rooms, and often their beds with other men, a model that Nyan Shah has called queer domesticity in speaking of Chinese immigrants. Now, we don't know, and we can't know to what extent these roommates had romantic or sexual relations with each other in their rooms, but their daily lives and emotions were centered on each other. In fact, Jiro Onuma, the gay Issei bachelor who Tina Takemoto has studied, was a more statistically predominant model for the immigrant generation of Japanese, in his lifestyle at least, if not necessarily his sexual object choice, than was the nuclear family regarded as normative through the generations. So if we don't understand that the majority of Japanese men were single and that the community was built as a bachelor community, we'll have a false idea of the history. The other essential point to grasp about these immigrants is that they came from Japanese society with quite different practices and taboos from Victorian America. In pre-modern Japan, the system of danshoku, comrade loves, was glorified, in which mature samurai took as lovers adolescent males whom they trained in the ways of the warrior. Throughout the Tokugawa era, alternate sexualities such as prostitution and male homosexuality were quite visible. And during the Meiji era, when Japanese started to come to North America, they were only gradually becoming associated with sin under the influence of Westernization and white Christian missionaries. By the way, this year's Queer History column, which will appear in the next, I think, issue of the Nichibei, discusses K.T. Takahashi, a Japanese immigrant whose 1892 short story, Love in Nippon, is the first published English language work of creative fiction by a Japanese American. It is a gender-bending queer romance featuring a love affair between two men. So once settled in America, Japanese immigrants and their children absorbed dominant Christian views of homosexuality as contemptible and unmentionable. Nisei men, frequently relegated to gardening or domestic labor and sensitive over dominant stereotypes of Asians as less masculine, may have wished to distance themselves as well from homosexuality as effeminate. Women in the Japanese community were discouraged from any sexual or behavior or desires, at least outside of marriage. As a result, within Japanese communities throughout the mid-20th century, gays and lesbians were largely invisible and unwelcome. For example, in a 1934 column in the newspaper Nichibei Shimbun, editor Larry Tajiri mentioned a Nisei, quote, homosexual, that is homo-sexual, in Los Angeles who faced constant harassment and who suffered so badly that he committed suicide at a young age. I myself have heard various Nisei women tell of a gentle and scholarly Nisei boy who was hounded into killing himself, such that it became a cautionary tale for the community. Yet amid this general silence, there did remain hints of the existence of alternate sexuality, predominantly among men. In news stories, diaries, letters, and creative fiction published across the century, both in English and Japanese, Nikkei authors, as well as outside observers, approached this taboo subject mostly in indirect fashion. Now, examining and interpreting those sources, as I explained in the Unsung Great, can be rather a maddening process, precisely because of their ambiguous content and messages. But they provide effectively our only glimpse into the lives of Issei and Nisei LGBT before the current period, and give us vital clues as to the nature of opinion on sexuality within the larger community. Last year, I was delighted to see and help advise on the Jeisei exhibition, Seen and Unseen, organized by Amy Tsuyoshi and Stan Yogi with the help of Andrew Wei Leong. It featured a number of such sources, and Tomo Hirai reported on in Nichibei. All the same, we need to restore from invisibility the queer Nikkei of an earlier period, even as we need to uncover the process a half century later of becoming visible and the bravery of the people who made it possible. Much of the Unsung Greats queer history section, thus, is devoted to the LGBT Nikkei and their allies who campaigned for equal rights after 1970 and mostly after 1980, and who raised community consciousness. For example, I discuss the importance of Judy Tachibana's 1979 Rafu Shimpo art series on Japanese American lesbians, and then Jeff Sakuma's articles in the Seattle newspaper International Examiner the following year. I speak of the leading role of lesbians from Michio Fukaya to Pamela Hamanaka in changing community attitudes, and the importance of the civil rights activist Marsha Izumi in championing equality for trans people of all races. I discuss also the question of military service for sexual minorities as a bellwether issue for Nisei and Sansei, leading up to the JCL's groundbreaking vote in 1994 in favor of equal marriage rights for same-sex couples, a vote that divided that venerable civil rights group and durably reshaped it. My hope is that these sketches will help inspire people to think about the development of LGBTQ Asian communities and cultures, and to what extent there is a specifically Nikkei aspect to them, and then how in turn these shaped and still shape the larger group. I would beg permission to put in a plug for the organization Okari, an LGBTQ Nikkei community, which will have its next conference online in November 2021. Well, to conclude, it seems to me that there's a great deal that remains to be studied about this process. There have been a few groundbreaking books. I tip my hat to Eric Watt for his book, The Making of a Gay Asian Community, on Tak Yamamoto and the group Asian Pacific Lesbians and Gays in Los Angeles. I'm also greatly pleased as well as honored to have here today Randall Kikukawa. Randall was the inspirer and spokesperson for the group of activists who protested at gay bars in San Francisco that excluded Asian patrons in the years 1980 and 1981. This campaign launched LGBTQ Asian social and political groups in San Francisco, culminating with the creation of GAPA, Gay Asian Pacific Alliance, as it was called then, in 1987, 1988. And I'm also pleased to have Jonathan Van Harmelen here because of the work he's undertaken on the history of GAPA and on particularly on their newsletter called Lavender Godzilla. And finally, I'm pleased to have Tina Takemoto here because of their work on Asian, queer, and feminist art and performance. So thank you very much for listening. I'm interested in what you on the panel and you in the audience have to tell me and to discuss. So thank you very much.
And thank you very much, Greg. And thank you for your fascinating work over all these years. I'd like now to move over to our second presenter this afternoon, Jonathan Van Harmelen, whom you just heard Greg mention earlier a few times. Jonathan is a PhD student at the University of California, Santa Cruz, specializing in political history and Asian American history. He and Greg have both worked together on pieces for The Great Unknown for the Nichibei Weekly, as well as publishing on the Discover Nikkei blog and Rafu Shimpo. Jonathan.
Hello. So first, I would like to thank JANM for hosting this event today, and thank you, Toma, for the introduction, and Greg for inviting me to say something about the Unsung Great and the larger question of queer history. Although I've had the good fortune of collaborating with Greg on a number of various projects, such as with the Nichibei, the essay we co-wrote on Brother Theophane Walsh that appears in the Unsung Great is quite special to me, as it was our first project together and contributes to a larger book project on Japanese Americans and the Catholic Church, which we are working on right now. I am also delighted to present alongside a number of distinguished panelists here, notably Randy. I was fortunate to meet Randy during pre-COVID times in October 2019, and my meeting with him helped inspire me to learn more about the history of the Gay Asian Pacific Alliance, or GAPA, in San Francisco, and led in turn to my current research on their newsletter, Lavender Godzilla. I also do want to speak a bit about myself in relation to LGBT and Asian American history. Both in my solo work and in my collaborations with Greg, I feel that acknowledging my own positionality in both these overlapping fields as a cis hetero white male is a necessity, as it underlines the need for caution and humility in making historical judgments. At the same time, I find that viewing these fields from an outside perspective enables me to draw from them and speak to what is missing in other fields of history. As a part of my own column for JANM's blog, Discover Nikkei, which was aforementioned, my own work endeavors to uncover stories that are not only revealing of the Japanese American experience, but also speak to broader issues within both United States history and even world history. So let me explain. As Greg mentioned in his remarks, the search for the, quote, unsung great is not simply to uncover lost stories, important as that is, but to help better understand the history of the larger Japanese American community. In the case of the aforementioned Issei bachelors, perhaps one of the least understood groups in Japanese American history, viewing them within the scope of the gay-straight continuum and the traditional nuclear family model obscures an essential part of the story. Because the founding generation of Japanese Americans pre-1907 was composed predominantly of younger single men, examining the early Japanese American community through the lens of queer history not only allows us to better comprehend their experiences and the community institutions they built, but also opens the door to greater understandings of other earlier, quote, settler communities, such as even the Jamestown colony or the white settlers of the Old West. And so looking through the lens of queer history also reveals the gender views of US immigration laws that blocked women from immigrating and led to the forced creation of a gendered binary by the states, which obscured the complex realities of gender identity and influenced the normative understanding of immigration history. In other words, to summarize, studying the Issei can help historians see the American past beyond the Eurocentric nuclear family model and gay-straight binary in order to help better appreciate its true nature. That said, in a different sense, about the importance of studying the Asian American, or that's the same can be said in a different sense about the importance of studying the Asian American LGBT communities plus of the West Coast and Hawaii during the 1980s and 90s. So Lavender Godzilla, as I mentioned, GAPA's monthly community newsletter founded in 1986, serves as a remarkable window into the lives of its contributors. Included within its pages are their personal accounts or the individual personal accounts of dealing with racism and anti-gay bigotry, especially amid the AIDS epidemic. its pages also offer an important window into the solidarity between LGBTQ and other human rights activism, such as reports on GAPA's march in support of students at Tiananmen Square in 1989. Although it was a Pan-Asian group, a number of GAPA's leaders and correspondents were Japanese Americans in particular. But perhaps I should offer the virtual mic to Randy to speak of that era of activism. Thank you.
Thank
you,
you,
Jonathan. About your, for your collection of all this hard work that you've done. Next up, we have Randy Kikukawa, who actually lived through this amazing period of history and made some history himself. Randy has been involved in activism for well over 40 years. In 1980, he helped organize a protest against anti-Asian discrimination in gay bars in San Francisco and had a hand in the formation of GAPA, which you heard mentioned before, GLBTQ plus Asian Pacific Alliance in 1988. He is now the music director of the GAPA Men's Chorus and managing director of the Golden Gate Men's Chorus, both members of the Gay and Lesbian Association of Choruses. We're happy to have you here, Randy. Take it away.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me here. Just to give a little background because of how I got to this place. When I was an undergraduate in college, I was lucky enough to be post-Stonewall, so it was a little easier to come out, even though it was a little closeted back in those days. So I was the president of the undergraduate organization. When I came to Berkeley for graduate studies, there was also a gay group there. I was the co-director of that with a lesbian member of the organization. But there was also a small Asian American group. I don't remember if they had an official name, but it was a gay and lesbian Asian American group of students, and we marched in the parade in the 70s, and then that slowly evolved. In 1980, I was at a party, and somebody mentioned to me the problem of being kept out of the bars and establishments in San Francisco if you were an Asian American man, or even if you were Black or Hispanic as well. The problem that they were talking about was being carded by and being asked for 5 photo IDs. And I actually experienced that a couple times at places. And so we sort of commiserated on this, and we started studying that to see whether or not this was actually true. I mean, we actually sent in groups of 2 or 3 Asian Americans, 1 white person and 2 Asians, 2 white people and 1 Asian. And we discovered that in almost all cases, they were actually asking for photo IDs, multiple photo IDs from only the Asian American groups. And if you happen to be in a large group of people and the only person was Asian, maybe you would get away with it, maybe you wouldn't. So anyway, at this party, they said, oh, well, we need to do something about this, but nobody wanted to come out and be the public face for that. And because I was so out at that point, because of being the head of different student groups, I said, well, I'll certainly do that for them. And they said, okay, we'll arrange it. And so I actually didn't have a lot to do with the organization of the protests. I simply said I would be the face of them and give my and appear at that, speak at different organizations in the Democratic clubs. So I believe it was November of 1980 was when we actually started protesting at gay establishments and gay bars. And there was a lot of pushback from the gay community because they said this will give the appearance that there's racism in the lesbian and gay community, which will make us look bad when we're fighting for our own rights. And our answer was basically, well, this is the reality. This is what we need to do. If you don't want to have protests, you need to establish the fact that we are equal. So a lot of the media was called, radio, newspapers. There was a big media, what is it? There was a lot of publication of this in November after the protest. We protested at several different bars in Polk Street and Castro. And the culmination of that was basically that the policy of asking for multiple photo IDs was simply erased. None of the bar owners would actually admit to anything, but simply they stopped doing it. And as it was pointed out, in 1981, after this, we decided there had to be a formal group, and the ALGA, which was the Association of Lesbian and Gay Asians, was founded. This group sort of met. It was a social and political group. It sort of continued for about 7 or 8 years before it finally sort of developed into GAPA, which was the Gay Asian Pacific Alliance, which this year renamed itself to be the LGBTQ plus Asian Pacific Alliance, because we have decided that we need to be a little more inclusive. So anyway, that gives a full timeline, actually, all the way through 1988, when GAPA was founded. GAPA has been in existence and has been active since that time. So it's a very important organization, not only in the Bay Area, but for California and the nation as well. There have been other gay and lesbian and queer Asian American groups, but not as long-lived as GAPA has been. As was pointed out, it is across all different Asian cultures, including South Asian, East Asian, Southeast Asian. My involvement with them has been since 1991 as the music director of the Chorus, which is the public face of the organization, because we go out to different events and perform in the greater Asian American community, like at Chinese New Year's events, at the Japanese festivals and Filipino festivals. So basically, it is the gay presence in the Asian American community, and that is more or less their mission, unlike many other gay choruses which want to be the music group in the lesbian and gay communities. So anyway, that is basically the story that I have to tell. I would like to turn it back to Tomo.
Well, thank you, Randy. And your work is amazing to hear about, and your role is no doubt invaluable to the fabric of history. Last and but not least, we have award-winning artist and scholar Tina Takemoto. Their work explores Asian American queer history, including the hidden dimensions of same-sex intimacy and queer sexuality for Japanese Americans incarcerated by the US government during World War II. I'll say I've been a bit of a fan of TT's work over the years. TT is also a board member of the Queer Cultural Center and co-founder of the Queer Conversations on Culture and the Arts, and is currently the Dean of Humanities and Sciences at California College of the Arts in San Francisco. Great to have you here, Dina. Or Dee.
Hi there. So thank you so much for that introduction. So I decided that I would address my comments directly to Greg after reading his wonderful chapter on queer Nikkei history. So here goes. So Greg, congratulations. Your book provides such a rich tapestry of Nikkei histories, including queer Nikkei histories. And it's really wonderful to read and revisit your individual entries that delve into the specific topics, such as homophobia, in a manner that candidly acknowledges the rise and fall of these sentiments within our communities. As a chapter, it is also compelling to read your selected writings side by side. It was interesting to see how the Nikkei community was struggling to come to terms with queerness and effeminacy in the 1970s, alongside accounts of first-person coming out narratives by bold Japanese American lesbians and gay men in the same decade. So seeing those two together was really powerful. And being able to experience these writings in conversation with each other provides such a dynamic picture of the complex and changing landscape of queer Nikkei history. So in our conversation today, I really hope that you will speak more about your research process, as well as your approach to selecting and curating the entries that you included in your book. I was also very moved by the opening section of your chapter, where you describe evidence as one of the greatest problems in studying the history of sexuality, especially when it comes to the trickiness of sussing out queer Nikkei histories that might have been deliberately denied, erased, or obscured. As you suggest, this predicament has both scholarly and ethical dimensions. You encourage us to consider questions such as, how can we reconstruct the past based on tiny bits of evidence of same-sex intimacy or gender nonconformity? How do we detect and decode these glimmers of queerness without falling prey to overinterpretation? And what are the implications of outing or unveiling information that may have originally been intended to stay hidden or obscured? I'm especially intrigued by the story you tell about coming across an ambiguous literary passage referring to two Nisei soldiers sharing hamburgers and love letters in the middle of the night. While you rightly express your concerns over the potential pitfalls of asserting the queerness or the gayness of this story without having further evidence to back it up, you also richly convey the thrill that arises from discovering and delving deeper into this tantalizing ketchup-smeared tale. To me, these moments of excitement and anticipation are one of the unique joys of doing queer research. And from the perspective of art practice, this is the type of delicious ambiguity that tickles the mind and opens up possibility for queer speculation. While these leaps of imagination are perhaps less appropriate in historical scholarship, I would still love to hear more of your thoughts on the queerness of doing queer research. And finally, I wanted to end my remarks on a more personal note of gratitude and reflection. When I looked back into my email archive, I found a string of messages that began in May 2009. At the time, I was working with the Jiro Onuma collection at the GLBT Historical Society and just starting my Looking for Jiro project. Lynn Horiuchi introduced us to each other via email, and you generously shared a sneak peek of your great unknown entry that was going to come out the next month. And it included some discussion of Jiro Onuma. So after voraciously reading this, I was so eager to meet you and to learn more that, based on the emails, it looks like I pretty much barraged you with lots and lots of questions. And you wrote back to me with such patience and humility and encouragement. So I hope you don't mind that I share part of one of the messages that you wrote to me. So I can't see your face right now, so I'm just going to assume that you're giving me permission, and then I'm going to read the quote. So this is what you wrote. I look forward to speaking with you too, but I must warn you that I am no expert in this domain. My principal research is on Japanese American intellectuals and political activists, especially their connections with African Americans. My work on sexuality is a kind of sidelight informed by my own experience as a gay man with an Asian partner. It is analogous, I suppose, to that of those Asian Americans who do not concentrate on Asian American studies, but keep an interest for personal reasons. That's the end of the quote. So 12 years after this exchange, I just really want to thank you for continuing to do this work on your Sidelight project, which has flourished into this wonderful chapter and collection of essays. You and your work continue to inspire me and so many others, and I am delighted that we can celebrate your contributions to queer Nikkei history together today. Thank you so much.
And thank you, TT, for sharing your work with Greg over the years and your thoughts. Now I'd like to move to the Q&A portion of the program. I don't see any open questions at the moment, so if any of you would like to start giving us any questions, feel free to pop that in. I don't recall seeing any questions in the chat either, but please send them along. In the meantime, and by all means, please ask any questions for both Greg or any of the panelists as well. In the meantime, while we wait for additional questions, I can get started with one, unless there's something that unless Greg, you wanted to respond to TT's reading or anything like that.
I wanted to respond first with enormous gratitude, and TT also modestly neglects to say that they were wonderfully kind with offering my partner and me a copy of Looking for Jiro Onuma for queer Asian Canadian Pacific film festival in Montreal, and that it was not yet in circulation, and yet since I had seen the film, I had asked TT if TT would allow us to use it, and TT sent me a video, and it was the final event of the Gay and Lesbian Arts evening and talent show, and it brought down the house, particularly when TT's description of Jiro Onuma with Crisco appeared on the screen. But I do feel necessary, I want to say also that with Jonathan's collaboration, I've started a more regular visit to the question of LGBT Japanese American history. Jonathan and I are putting together a book which we've tentatively called Striking Camp, which is about the intersections between Japanese American history and LGBT history. And it goes again from the 1890s and the beginnings with K.T. Takahashi, the author that I mentioned, who, by the way, ran a bookstore in Montreal and lived in Montreal for a decade, and then goes on to discussing the Quixotes, the lovers who passed as sisters in camp, and then went on, each of them, to create quite striking careers, and brought again together the question of Japanese Americans and LGBT questions. And then there are other chapters, and it goes on to particularly the Japanese American press in the pre-war era and the coverage of LGBT, and then goes on to the activism of the 80s and 90s that Jonathan has been describing and Randy has been discussing from his own experience. If there are not other questions yet, please.
Yes. We're still waiting for questions, but I did prep a couple just for this occasion. And so, speaking of the research process, as TT mentioned, how do you come across these people, these stories, these queer, moments in history or perceived queer moments? Are they sought out, or are they just something that you stumble upon as you're doing work as scholars?
in most cases, I stumble on them. I do a lot of reading of Japanese American history and particularly of the newspapers. We are particularly lucky that for a community that was destroyed by the wartime experience, so much of the pre-war community press has survived. And then again, it was, with the exception possibly of the Jews, the most literate minority community. I mean, Japanese immigrant women were able to come to the United States as picture brides because in a large number of cases, they stayed in Japan to get educated and age themselves out of the marriage market. And thanks to universal elementary education in Japan, they were practically 100% literate, far more literate than the average white woman of their time. And so they encouraged their Nisei children to engage in literature, to commit literature. And so there were various Japanese American writers who picked up on queer issues, either because they were queer themselves or because it was that which they saw in the Bohemians around them, or because of their connections. And then it was also the Japanese American communities that began to produce plays in the early 1970s. So in fact, 2 plays written by non-Japanese Americans with Japanese American protagonists. Suntek O's Tonde Manai, which was the first commercial play to portray the camps and portray the Japanese American incarceration experience, was also a gay play, featuring an affair between a Kibe Nisei and a 3rd generation Chinese American. And then Coda by Alberto Isaac, a 1973 play that featured a Japanese American playwright in a romantic triangle. Again, these are some of the very first Asian American plays, but because of the milieu, I suppose, of dramatics and the cosmopolitanism of the city environments, they were open to exploring different aspects of sexuality and politics within the community.
Anyone else want to take a crack at that question?
Let me ask TT, how did you find Jiro Onuma?
Great, thanks. So I was invited to join a project that was organized through the GLBT Historical Society in San Francisco. So the artist E.G. Crichton had selected a number of personal archival collections, and she basically matched them with living artists, writers, musicians. So she matched me with Jiro Onuma. And at the time, his collection was the only collection of a gay Japanese American, and among the very few Asian American collections within the archive. And that's changed dramatically over the last 10 years, which is really great. But yeah, so that was the way that I found my way to Jiro Onuma.
And we appear to have a couple of questions that have rolled in. So shall I move on to that?
Please.
Okay. First, we have one from Emily. I've often wondered if Nisei who have been closeted have sought any of you out and shared their experiences with you. I have been so curious about this history with the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, which you've already touched on a bit, as well as in camp in general.
I can answer for myself that I have not been contacted by any gay Nisei. A Nisei friend who I spoke to said he didn't know any gay Nisei. He said the closet was very deep and dark. And I think that it's been an enormous thing to have people starting to come out of the closet. I mean, I think about George Takei, who is nowadays the public face of, queer Japanese Americans, but he himself did not come out of the closet publicly until he was almost 70 years old. And so I think that there was such enormous community pressure that it was very difficult for people in the Nisei generation to come out publicly. And of course, there were occasional exceptions, like Johnny Nojima, who worked for the Mattachine Society and helped run its magazine, One Magazine. And there was a sensei, Stephen Kyoshi Kuramiya, who was a pro-civil rights activist who worked with Martin Luther King and who came out of the closet in the mid-1960s. But I have had such difficulty trying to speak to people. I mean, part of it is my own reticence about asking people about their private lives. You know, I have never been able to, I have had ethical issues. I've never been able to even ask somebody, are you gay? And so it's been very difficult for me to track down gay people, and particularly even people who are nominally out, that finding closeted gay people has really been something that I haven't been able to do.
So I had the opportunity to interview and look at the archival collection of Sab Shimono, who he identifies as Nisei and a half, because he's his so second and a half generation. But you know, he's almost the precise age as George Takei. And I think many of us know that his career in television and theater and film is you know, more than 50 years long. He's someone who probably would not describe himself as closeted, that in other words, he has lived as an open gay man in relation to his private circles, but he certainly has not been publicly out in his professional life for a very long time. I was able to visit his archival collection at the Smithsonian before I actually had the opportunity to meet with him in person. So my strategy was to put together this kind of experimental film love letter to him that was based on the alphabet. So I used a lot of keywords from his life, including gay bars that he liked to frequent, but also, you know, things about his family experience and camp experience. And I put it together in this experimental film form. And it intrigued him enough to want to talk to me. And it kind of opened up this conversation. And he even allowed me to interview him on camera. So I have a short documentary, but I don't know that he's super comfortable with it circulating in the world yet. So, but it took many years to develop this relationship, and it's sort of continuing to develop in a way in terms of his level of comfort about talking about this specific issue in relation to himself.
I should add that there's a fascinating play by Philip Kangotanda called Yankee Dog, You Die, and where there's an older Asian American actor and a younger, more militant one. And the older man, who is, we realize he's a closeted Japanese American. That is, he's closeted in the sense that he's passing as some other Asian. And he's also closeted in the sense that he's, you know, hiding his homosexuality, although that's a rather more subtle aspect of the play. But Philip Kangotanda, I heard him say once that he had, you know, met all of these old style, you know, Asian American actors, and so many of them were gay, but, you know, you wouldn't know it by reading their biographies and looking at their work. So yes, TT reminds us that Sab Shimono was in fact, I think it was in the premiere, in fact, the performance. I mean, it's been revived at various times.
He played both the older role and the younger role within his career. So initially he played the younger role, and then when it was revived, he played the older role. So he talks a bit about that. It's kind of great.
Randy, I'm a little curious. As a pioneer yourself, have people approached you over the years?
I love that you call me a pioneer.
Oh,
Oh, no sound? Hold on.
You're muted.
Here.
Has the sound come back?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, good. Thank you. No, I still find it funny that people call me a pioneer because I still don't feel that way. But no, a lot of people have actually approached me. Most of them are doctoral students. There was one person about 10, 15 years ago who was writing a study on, oh God, he was from Temple University in Pennsylvania, and he was writing an article about interracial couples and on how just the dynamics of that, and also I think he wrote an article something about like you're not our type or something like that. I can't remember the exact title. And then more recently, I've had some scholars come from Japan who came to interview me. Apparently, they Googled and found my name. I mean, there's a lot of information on. If you Google my name, it brings up pages and pages. I'm unable to hide on the internet. But no, I mean, a lot of the activism, I think, occurred in the 1970s and 80s that I was participating in. And as I pointed out, more recently, in more recent decades, I've mostly been involved in music. But because of that activism from that period, and so many people are now interested in that period, I think a lot of people want to actually talk to someone who lived through it. From my point of view, it's just my life, so it's not that interesting, but obviously it has some interest to other people. And of course, Greg contacted me. Greg, that was back in, I guess it was mid-2019, or my mind is, I can't remember with the pandemic, but just interested because there was a very widespread photograph that was taken of me by Rink, who was a photographer here in San Francisco. When we did the protest in 1980, we contacted all the media, and so Greg Day and Rink and a whole bunch of other professional photographers were there. And for some reason, Rink's photo sort of captured the moment, and it just sort of had a life of its own. It's appeared in galleries in Berlin and London and New York and just all over the place. My friends have actually said, I was in an art gallery and I saw you in the art gallery. So it's very sort of surprising. But also just recently I've discovered that in the archives of the GLBT Society, a historical society here in San Francisco, they've found the live interviews that I did for the radio during that protest on the sidewalk. So I was actually able, just only about 2 weeks ago, to actually listen to what I had to say, because of course it's all in my memory, and memory sometimes is not very accurate. So it was interesting to hear my own voice. I mean, they did like a 10-minute segment on KPFA radio here in San Francisco. But so I'm sort of diverging from the original question. You said, are people in contact with me? Over the years, quite a few people actually. A lot of younger, actually Asian gay men have contacted me to ask me what it was like to grow up and be out in the 1970s and 80s. And I always tell them it's a lot better today.
But still, you didn't even get to know the previous generation. Like, people didn't tell you about gay life in camp.
No, my family didn't talk at all about the camps. I actually found out about the camps from reading about it when I was in high school. All I knew was we lived in Seattle, and then we moved to Idaho, and then we moved to Milwaukee. And I grew up in Milwaukee. And so when I asked about that, they said, oh yeah, we just moved to the Midwest. It was never, we were forced to move here. Interestingly, all the men of military age in my family volunteered to fight in the war. There were 6 family members who fought in the 442nd. And one of my great uncles was killed in Italy, but all the others survived and came back home. and never spoke about it again. I didn't realize that any of them fought in the 442nd until I started doing ancestry, genealogy research, and found their photographs and found things from the war when they were in Europe. So I think a lot of it is that Japanese Americans are just very reticent. They're very much don't want to stick out in society. And I think that's the reason why people like talking to me, because I don't have that trait.
Jonathan, you have one?
Yeah, I was going to say one thing. This is somewhat related. Since you mentioned talking again about the 442nd Rantee, I shared there's a issue I found once of the Stars and Stripes that Greg and I talked about once, where it was a photo of two Nikkei soldiers, I think somewhere in France. And it was the way the photo was taken. It was quite fascinating because it was these two men that were kind of hugging and like rolling in the snow. And we've kind of speculated about that photo in some of these different ways. But I mean, as I think Greg, as everyone here has kind of talked about, there's so little out there in relation to the Nikkei. So, but anyway, I mean, that was just something that I remember that one of the few things that stood out to me.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I had a fire in my place a couple months ago, so I had to rescue a whole bunch of archives that I had. And I have all of my family photos. I have several hundred photographs taken in the camps. And many of them are military photos because they were taken by my great uncle when he was on leave visiting. And so I have to actually take a look at that. He also left a lot of negatives that I haven't actually developed. So I'm gonna have to take a look at that or turn it over to some archive at some point and identify the people in them, because I think I'm probably the last person in my family who would be able to identify where these were taken and what they're of. So. But as you pointed out, I don't know of any lesbian or gay family members from that generation. I know that they must have existed because in my generation there are probably 6 or 7 of us that I know of. And in my immediate family there are 3 of us. So they had to have existed. Whether or not they were out is another question. And even if they were out, whether they actually told people outside of their group is probably the reason why we don't know about their stories.
All right, thank you. I do have a question here from Heather. Hi all, as Greg knows, I have found a very limited bit of material about A, overt sexuality, and B, gay life in the incarceration camps. And I wonder if any of you have any insight into how LGBTQ plus people navigated the experience of confinement. In the literary magazines that were produced in some of the camps, the bachelor quarters are referenced with a bit of entendre, but that's about all I've got. Any ideas?
I should say that I found very little, but one of the most extraordinary, tantalizing, fascinating pieces is Karen Kehoe's book, City in the Sun, which was published in 1946. And again, Karen Kehoe is a woman who changed her last name to that of her lover so that she and her lover could pass themselves off as sisters. They were non-Japanese and both work in the camp at Gila River. And after leaving camp, also with a young Nisei boy that they had promised to take out of camp and get adopted so that he could get out of camp earlier, she and her lover broke up. And Karen Kehoe went on to be a student at Hunter College. She was about 24 years old. And she wrote a novel about the camp, both about the inmates and about the staff, the white staffers suffering. And in this case, the young boy from the teenage boy from the Japanese American family, that's wonderful, Tomo, cool, gets involved with a gang, and there are these homoerotic scenes. And so the question is, did they, how realistic is that? I mean, various reviewers, including Mina Okubo, talked about just how realistic the novel was. So would Kehoe have put that in the novel if it didn't correspond to some reality, perhaps based on what the teenage Nisei that they brought out of camp might have told them. But on the other hand, in order to maintain the secret of their own relationship, her lover said that in her oral history at the San Francisco Gay and Lesbian Historical Society, said that they didn't tell anybody and they didn't socialize with anybody in order to keep their own secret. So unfortunately, Karen Kehoe passed away, and I don't have any way of knowing, but it makes me think that perhaps it must not have been completely, divorced from reality, while not necessarily reflecting specific incidents. But there's so, I know John Howard in his book, Concentration Camps on the Home Front, has a police report. One police, internal police in one of the camps finds these two guys, with their pants down. So there's just these little scraps of information. TT spoke about the beginning of my chapter where I talk about the perils of trying to interpret small pieces of data. I compare myself to my colleagues who study ancient history and have to look at scraps of papyrus or inscriptions on monuments and try and interpret whole cultures from that with no idea whether they're getting something wrong. McGeorge Bundy wrote about being a professor and a student interpreting a document from when he was in the White House that John F. Kennedy had written. He had written a report for John F. Kennedy, and Kennedy had written on it "helpful," and so the student had, made this interpretation, thus that it was a wonderful document, and Bundy had to break to him he was being sarcastic. So I think there's all that kind of space for getting something wrong, and yet, we have nothing else to go on but our noses.
Thank you. We have no other audience questions, but I did have one question. History informs what's going to, often informs what's going to happen in the future. And so how do you all feel LGBTQ Japanese Americans will play? What kind of role will they play moving forward from today on? From what you've observed?
I'll start with that if nobody else wants to. I think the specific Japanese American identity, as separate from other minority groups, is becoming less and less important in terms of allyship. And so I actually think more in terms of Asian American, and even beyond that, in terms of Asian American plus basically all other people who are allies of the LGBT community. And so I think that there's a lot more integration of the Japanese American gay community into the larger gay community. And if not that, at least in the API community. I should point out that this past May was the very first QT API week declared ever in any American city, and that was by at the insistence of GAPA. We asked our supervisor to have the board of supervisors here in San Francisco declare the last week of May QT API week in San Francisco, and it was a transition from the Asian American Heritage Month, which was May, into Pride Month, which is June. And so it was very fitting that we had that week that celebrated queer, transgender, gay, lesbian, bisexual, API people in the community. And we had a whole week of events, and I actually spoke at that too at the end of the party at the end of it. So to answer that, I think that going forward, it's less of a specific Japanese American identity and more of a a coalition of all people and our allies who are interested in forwarding equality for all groups. And that is specifically in the mission of GAPA, because they changed. I actually was the person who made the motion to change the organization name from Gay Asian Pacific Alliance to the GLBTQ plus Asian Pacific Alliance to make it more inclusive. And I know that saying it's inclusive does not make it so, but it cannot possibly become inclusive if you don't actually try and invite the people into your group.
I'm hesitant as an outsider to the community to say what influence gay and lesbian and the LGBTQ Japanese Americans specifically and Asian Americans can have. I think that, as Jonathan suggested, studying the past in terms of the immigration pattern can help us with a great deal of re-examination of population patterns, social customs, social structures in American history. And both in terms of the facts of bachelor communities, but also, again, non-Christian, as you know, in the white America that the Japanese Americans came to, or the America that the Japanese immigrants came to, was an almost 100% Christian America. There were a small number of Chinese who were Buddhist but did not have congregations. There was a small minority of Jewish Americans, but basically they faced a Christian country and a largely Protestant country, although a significant Catholic minority that associated Christianity with progress and modern civilization. As Duncan Ryukin Williams has put in American Sutra, that religious bias against Japanese Americans was strong. So when we now have Japanese Americans achieving positions of power, able to introduce non-Christian perspectives, I think they also have a privileged way of making us think about diversity and tolerance.
Yeah, I mean, I was also thinking of, following on what Greg just said, thinking a bit about how queer and trans Japanese Americans, you know, in the present, are probably much more open to thinking about the past differently. So I do think that within the JA community, we have tended to tell the story of wartime incarceration through narratives of family, through narratives of heroism in relation to the 442nd. And I think we think of it in relation to intergenerational trauma, and all of those things, of course, are true. But I think, you know, queer and trans Japanese Americans also know commonsensically, as Randy was saying, like out of more than 110,000 people, there had to be some of us folks there, you know? And so I think having an openness to the idea that, of course, there were same gender loving and gender non-conforming folks in the wartime camp era, like, of course, that was the case, I think opens up the possibility for expanding the way we talk about and think about history. So, so Tom, I'm answering your question through the past, but I think it's folks in the present that are going to help us do that more expansively.
It's great to have you all to be talking about the work of re-understanding the past using these things. I mean, it's like Jonathan spoke about Jamestown. And that is, you know, if we realize that the majority of people in camp, or rather the majority of Issei in camp, were not in family units. They were bachelors who were put together in units by the WRA. They did not have solo rooms. That we have a better idea of, you know, again, the social structures of the Japanese community. And as Titi says, absolutely, you know, while intergenerational trauma was, of course, a central element, we have to discuss this particular Issei bachelor experience as a Japanese American experience, and indeed as a numerically predominant Japanese immigrant experience, or else we're going to misread the history. The thing is that the history was written by the kids, and so the kids think that mommy and daddy were the only ones who were there, and they don't think about, Uncle Jiro.
Mm-hmm. And to follow up on that as well, I think, as you were saying, TT, that there's the focus, or the predominant focus, on certain narratives that's there to, in many ways, they are true, but that excludes other narratives. That the amount of attention given to the specific, the basic camp narrative, the 442nd heroism, that it's the amount of attention given to that also leaves little room of exploring those other narratives, which are sometimes. It doesn't mean that they're not true either. As you're saying, that there definitely were people that that were either non-gender binary, or that were queer, that were in camp. It's just either the evidence hasn't been found yet, or those are the stories that are still to be found. It's interesting because I was thinking about also with the question that was mentioned earlier about literary people. There was this Buddhist priest, also to talk about with Buddhist priests. There was this white priest named Ronald Latimer Lane, who was originally a poet, a award-winning poet who was at Columbia, then became an editor, and then became a Buddhist priest, and was actually noted for testifying before the Tolling Committee in Los Angeles on behalf of Japanese Americans, and defending Buddhism not as this kind of religion of evil. I mean, as Duncan Williams talks about in his book, and speaking about Buddhism as what it was as a philosophy and as a belief system. And at one point, I believe he goes to Gila River during the war years, and he lives in Arizona for most of his life with his partner, which he passed as his adopted son. And so there's been some writing about him, which was published in the Poetry Foundation, but he's one of those stories that kind of is one that goes against what is, I guess, the people that did support Japanese Americans, especially during 1942, when there was a lot of white Americans that were racist and against the Japanese American community on the West Coast. And of course, as Greg was talking about with the Issei bachelors, the amount of attention that's been given to Issei bachelors, like with your work, TT, about Jiro Numa, there's been so little that has been written about it. It was funny because in another article I wrote where I interviewed this Buddhist priest, Laverne Sasaki, I was talking about his previous work, and he had mentioned as a young priest, he had worked with a lot of the Issei bachelors, which were he saw as being neglected by their family, or not by their families, but just being isolated by the community itself. That no one was speaking with them, no one was engaging with them, and they were often isolated. Sometimes because of this was, I guess, in the late 60s. He mentioned they're often isolated. No one was taking care of them in these kind of like retirement homes. And so as a priest, he was someone who had spoken with them and felt that this was a problem that no one was giving attention to. So and back to kind of what Greg was saying about them being kind of one of the few and neglected groups in the community. Unfortunately, they've all passed, but it's one of those stories that still needs to be told. And as you were saying, TT, that those are the narratives that will come out more and more. So I guess to bring it back to your question, Tomo, of what it'll be for the future, I think is as we're observing with the present of looking for role models and leaders, of finding the importance in their narratives and finding those narratives again in the past, and having role figures again, or role models like George Takei or Mia Yamamoto, those individuals that draw public attention to these sort of narratives, not just in the broader spotlight, but even within the individual stories. So I think it's not the end all answer, but I think it's a start of kind of bringing attention to that history and having people realize what is taken for granted, I guess, with these historical narratives.
One can even hope that the existence of Japanese American LGBT, particularly as there is more connection between nations and Shin Issei and Issei, that ironically they may achieve the old dream of being a bridge between the United States and Japan, that in Japan there are starting to be LGBT activists who are fighting for same-sex marriage rights. For example, in Hokkaido, there just was a court case brought by people who had been living in the United States and had gotten used to American culture and went back to Japan and wanted to have the same kind of rights in Japan.
And so, yeah, thank you for entertaining my question there, and for all the other questions as well. And so thank you very much, TT, Jonathan, Randy, and most of all, Greg, for this great program. As a queer woman myself, I've always felt there's always been a dearth of representation over the years, but you know, the work that you do in uncovering and preserving this history really inspires me. And I think, Greg, you said this as well, but I hope this also inspires the greater community to expand what it means to be Japanese American. So with that said, I'd like to pass the baton on to Joy as we bring this program to a close. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tomo, and everyone who's watching at home. I hope you join me in a huge round of applause, and for each other as well here as the panelists. Yeah, just so grateful for this really exciting and I learned so much in this conversation. So really grateful to be expanding kind of what Japanese American identity and history can look like with all of you. So please get your hands on Greg's book. It is available in the JANM store. The link is in the bio and members get a discount. So please go check that out. It's really wonderful and filled with so many interesting stories that you won't have heard before. So with that, I'm going to say thank you again to everyone. We'll see you at the next program. And this recording will be online in about a month or so. So great. Thank you so much, everyone, and take care. Have a great afternoon.